Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Dwayne Johnson, Jack Black, Kevin Hart and Karen Gillan are back in the game in Jumanji: The Next Level. A dejected Spencer, played by Alex Wolff, repairs the destroyed game of Jumanji and goes back into the game world. When his friends discover this, they decide to venture in to find him, but the broken game doesn't allow them to select avatars. Whilst Morgan Turner's Martha is once again Karen Gillan's Ruby Roundhouse, Sedarius Blaine's Fridge instead finds himself in Jack Black's Professor Oberon. To make matters worse, Spencer's grandpa Eddie, played by Danny DeVito, and his friend Milo Walker, played by Danny Glover, have been sucked into the game as Dwayne Johnson's Dr. Bravestone and Kevin Hart's Finbar, respectively. Now this dysfunctional group must try to find Spencer and beat a new, even harder game of Jumanji. Back in 2017, Jumanji Welcome to the Jungle fast passed people's expectations for a 20-year-old franchise revival by being a smart, clever update on the story that actually managed to be one of the year's biggest surprises, and whisper it, probably better than the Robin Williams movie it's supposed to be a sequel to. It also proved itself to be a worthy bit of Star Wars counter-programming, managing to make almost $1 billion at the worldwide box office, so a sequel was quickly hurried into development. Now, 2 years later, and with another Star Wars movie on the way, we now have the third installment of the Jumanji series, The Next Level, or technically fourth if you count Zathura, and all the major elements of the previous movie have been brought back here, and that includes director Jake Kasdan. In fact, by blockbuster standards, the development of this sequel has been remarkably fast. They only started filming this back in February, and it's now December and we have a completed movie. That is insanely quick turnaround. But that does rather show in the finished product. That rush does mean that this movie really is more of the same, which isn't all that bad a thing, but it is rather fitting considering a lot of AAA game franchises are exactly the same thing. If anything, the problem with this sequel is the last one didn't exactly leave itself open for another. Far from it. The final moments of Welcome to the Jungle was Fridge dropping a bowling ball on the game to try and destroy it, in a rather refreshingly anti-sequel bait ending in this day and age. So that proves something of a problem for the writers trying to continue this story, and what they've come up with doesn't feel entirely natural, especially with regards to Spencer at the beginning of this movie, because he's essentially reverted back to how he was at the start of the last film, in that he's this shy, introverted young man who is lacking self-confidence again, so he decides to go back into the game to try and play as Dr. Bravestone again. And what this effectively does is wipes out the entirety of his character development from the first movie. And I know this is a fairly common thing with sequels, but it still makes it disappointing nevertheless. It's pretty clear that they were trying to find some excuse to try and bring all these characters back once again, but it never goes anything past a contrivance. So that means the movie starts out a little bit on the back foot, especially as it progresses and it becomes increasingly clear that what the writers are doing is just doing everything they did the first time around. It isn't just that The Next Level does all the things that you liked about the first movie, it does them in exactly the same order, in exactly the same structure. So you get the same sequence where they land in the jungle and they have to establish that you lose lives by having Jack Black's character get killed off all of a sudden. There's another sequence where, once again, Rhys Darby has to explain the plot to them as an expositional NPC character. There's a car chase sequence, but this time they're driving the cars, but it's still in the same spot in the narrative. There's a market town sequence in exactly the same way. It's pretty clear that the filmmakers knew that they had a winning formula and didn't want to mess with it too much, but even so, they could have done things a little bit more differently. They didn't have to do exactly the same things in precisely the same spots, and this also applies to the jokes as well. As true with a lot of comedy sequels, they have to trot out a lot of the same jokes they did the first time out because they were successful, but obviously when you tell a joke again, it's not as funny the first time out. Occasionally The Next Level does have a new spin on certain moments, but even so, it just reveals itself as being a carbon copy sequel in much the same tradition as Home Alone 2 or The Hangover Part 2, although At least it's a little bit better than the latter. But essentially, it's a victory lap in new locations. And I will say that it is still fun, but there is a constant nagging sense in the back of your mind that we're going through the motions, because we have seen all this before. We know exactly what's coming, and that takes away from a lot of the tension in the set pieces the film is trying to build up. And also, it makes you aware the filmmakers aren't exactly bringing the same level of creativity as they brought to the earlier installment, and they're just coasting along on the goodwill they generated with that. And because the mechanics are so identical, that means that many of the problems that were already in the first movie are back again here, and perhaps even more so. For example, the plot within the video game is even more secondary this time out, and that means the villain gets less development than Van Pelt did in its predecessor, and that's saying a lot. This one is so peripheral and so forgettable, played by Rory McCann, that I can't even remember what his name is. He gets a fairly significant introduction and even establishes a major link with Dr. Bravestone, but that goes absolutely nowhere, and the film does nothing with it. In fact, even when it's establishing this, it's purely for the sake of a goofy throwaway visual gag. It's not even taking it seriously at that moment, and this feels like a major missed opportunity to correct a significant fault with the first film, but instead they pretty much do the same thing, but perhaps even more so. He only appears when the plot needs him to, and he doesn't feel in any way intimidating. The reason why this movie still works as well as it does largely comes down to the charm of the central cast, who are absolutely hilarious together and are clearly enjoying themselves. They are one of the major reasons why the last one works as well as it did, and the same applies here, even as the movie tries to mix up their personalities to spruce things up a bit, which is one of the more successful ways it differentiates itself from its predecessor. Karen Gillan plays a much more confident version of Martha this time out, and because she's the most competent player in the game, that means that much of the story falls upon her. So she's essentially playing the straight man, but when she is offered a good gag, she definitely seizes upon it, and she throws herself into the action set pieces, even learning nunchucks for this movie, which I do wish the movie took slightly more advantage of. Jack Black is playing another variation on Professor Oberon, but essentially the character is another someone who's frustrated at having to inhabit this particular body. But I think the filmmakers were wise not to have Jack Black do the entire second movie doing the teenage girl shtick. That was one of the best elements of Welcome to the Jungle and how well Black performed that, but even so, doing that for another 2 hours would have hammered that joke into the ground. I think that Black acquits himself just as well here. Of the returnees, Nick Jonas is easily the one that gets the short shrift. He's reintroduced very late into the movie, just in time for the third act, and essentially the only reason he's here is because he was in the last one. It's essentially a glorified cameo, and they give him very little to do in this outing. Of course, the ones that most stand out are Dwayne Johnson and Kevin Hart. Now, this isn't a surprise for Johnson, because again, he was one of the best parts about the last movie, in that him playing against type and having to embody this shy, introverted boy inside this hulking, superpowered body really took advantage of Johnson's comedic chops. And this, again here, is another great example of it, because now Johnson has to spend much of the movie pretending to be Danny DeVito, and he is so funny at doing that. And watching Johnson having to embody all of his mannerisms and being really grouchy and crotchety is hilarious, especially the central gag that he's being played by someone that doesn't know what they're doing. They've got all of these abilities and they're just using them with reckless abandon. And this has a positive side effect in that Johnson is less of the central focus this time out. It feels much more like an ensemble because of it, although you still get the big action set pieces you would expect from a Dwayne Johnson movie, just done with a more heavy comedic accent. And it's nice to see Johnson stretching himself a little bit. In general, Danny DeVito is one of the strongest additions to the cast. He's got relatively brief screen time here, but even so, his presence can be felt all throughout the movie in the way that the other actors are portraying him and essentially carrying the torch. The man is a treasure, and it's nice to see how much they clearly love DeVito, and that's reflected in their performances. I think that DeVito definitely elevates this movie, and Hart is one of the biggest improvements. You might might recall that I singled him out as being a weak spot, in that he wasn't truly inhabiting his character, he was simply playing another Kevin Hart role to me. That's definitely not the case this time out. He's clearly channeling Danny Glover, and especially his cadence. Milo is extremely verbose and fails to get to the point quickly. Gee, I wonder who else has that particular problem. But that means that he's a great foil, especially for Johnson. And while this is a little bit of a reheat from the last movie again, in that Spencer and Fridge had this antagonistic dynamic, and again, Milo and Eddie have some old grudges they need to work out, which means these same two avatars are bickering with each other, Johnson and Hart make a great double act, and you can see that in all the films they've already done together. Awkwafina also slots herself in very nicely as a new character, a thief called Ming, and she actually gets funnier as the film goes along. She's a fairly crucial role, and because they brought back virtually the entire main cast and then add some new ones on top of that, it does start to understandably feel overcrowded. This is a movie that has 7 main characters in it, and trying to give all of them something to do and set up plot mechanics does start to weigh down on it, especially once we reach the second act. When we're in the market town, it's there where the pacing issues are most apparent. At 123 minutes, the next level is too long. It's just a bit too much of everything. And not helping this is Milo and Eddie. While they're good additions generally, one of their biggest problems is they're so slow on the uptake, struggling to even grasp that they're in a video game, which means the other characters have to slowly and repeatedly explain everything to them. And whilst this is getting newcomers up to speed, it draws attention to all the repetitions, and also we've seen a lot of this already. It feels like it bogs the movie down instead of getting to the new stuff it wants to show us. Where the filmmaker's attention's most obviously lay is in the action set pieces and trying to make them bigger and wilder than before. This is especially true of the standout sequence that wakes the film up from its middle act doldrums, where the characters have to jump across various bridges down a massive chasm, all whilst being chased. And that's an exceptionally well staged set piece. It's tense, it's exciting, and it's also got a real sense of jeopardy about it. It makes good use of the video game mechanic in much the same way the best moments of Welcome to the Jungle did, as the characters have to navigate and platform their way through it. Likewise, the aforementioned car chase, where they have to outrun a whole host of angry ostriches, seemingly inspired by Mad Max, is also quite wacky and enjoyable, even if those CGI ostriches are a little bit questionable, to say the least. But this speaks to one of the things that I did like about the next level, in that it's clear the filmmakers, in having to do all these things again, wanted to push the video game idea to its absolute limit and push it into the realms of absurdity, especially when one character starts playing as a horse. And that's what I wanted this movie to do. I wanted to go nuts with all the things that they established last time out. The movie adds a body swap mechanic, and that could have been used really creatively in this universe, but instead the movie used it in the most risk-averse way it could possibly do so, and essentially it's just there as a Deus Ex Machina, and there's so many promising possibilities they could have taken advantage of that they simply squander. Likewise, the idea that the game is broken hardly factors into the plot at all, aside from them not being able to select their own characters, and you would have thought they'd take that opportunity to add things like bugs or glitches, really mix things up in that way, but they don't. It's not that the next level doesn't have promising ideas, it's just that it fails to fully exploit them, which makes the fact that it goes through much of the same routines even more disappointing as you realise that it's playing it awfully safe. If you enjoyed Welcome to the Jungle, chances are you'll like Jumanji the Next Level, just not as much as the last one. It's pretty clear that all involved took the tack of don't fix what isn't already broken, and to be fair to them, they are right on that. A lot of what made that movie work is still here in abundance, especially that group camaraderie between Johnson, Gillan, Hart and Black. They're so entertaining, they carry the movie through most of its faults, but even so, they can't disguise the fact this doesn't have the same level of spark to it, and I wish there was a bit more ambition here. But essentially, the best way to consider this movie is just a bunch of bonus levels. levels is an excuse to do exactly more of what you loved the first time out. Jumanji The Next Level is fittingly similar to the average game franchise sequel in that it's the same thing with some new graphics. Luckily, the chemistry of Johnson, Black, Hart and Gillan remains strong even as the film alters their dynamics to freshen things up, and the additions of Awkwafina and especially Danny DeVito fit in nicely, with Johnson and us hilariously impersonating the latter. However, there isn't enough new here to distract you from how rigidly it adheres to the last film's structure, and while it does have some absurd additions that it should have taken more advantage of, the next level feels overly crowded as if to justify itself because the return to the game feels quite forced. There's definitely still fun to be had in what is essentially a cinematic expansion pack, but this isn't as fresh and inventive as its predecessor. If you like this review, then game on over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.